What if everything you thought you knew about time, place, and even logic itself was only part of this story? A man appears in a way that defies reason. No clues, no trail, just a name and a set of details that don't belong together. His arrival is more than an anomaly. It's a collision. A moment where paths converge and lives shift in ways that no one can trace. Every explanation collapses under the weight of the impossible, and still, the fact remains, unexplained, untouched by time, and unwilling to let go.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity, venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
This isn't just a story about disappearance. It's a disturbance, small but unsettling, in the steady rhythm of ordinary life. There are details that don't make sense, wounds that don't fit medical logic, and a second man, a by-the-book constable, whose path crossed a mystery, only to find himself dragged deeper into one of Britain's most baffling unsolved cases. It begins quietly, but something about the story stays with you, like the echo of footsteps in an empty room. Zigmund Adamski was, by all accounts, an ordinary man with a quiet life, but his story would become anything but. The man who stumbled upon him, a routine officer on a routine shift, would find himself caught in a far stranger web than police work ever prepared him for. What linked them, if anything, remains unclear. Yet in the space between their two paths, something unseen moved, something neither could have anticipated, and once their fates brushed against each other, nothing would be the same. Zigmund, or Ziggy Adamski, was a man shaped by hardship, resilience, and quiet devotion. Born in Poland in 1923, he came of age during the chaos of World War II. Like many displaced by the conflict, he sought a new beginning in England, eventually settling in the Yorkshire village of Tingley. There, he built a modest but stable life, marrying Leokada Hawalowska, or Lottie, in 1951, and taking up work as a coal miner at the Loft House Colliery. Ziggy was known as a dependable, steady man, hard-working, soft-spoken, and deeply committed to his family. But by 1980, the weight of years spent underground had taken its toll. He suffered from a chronic lung condition caused by coal dust, which left him short of breath and increasingly frail. He had been off work for several months and was in the process of applying for early retirement. Ironically, the letter approving his retirement would come the day after he vanished. At home, life was no easier. Lottie had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and was confined to a wheelchair. Ziggy had become her primary caregiver, tending to her needs with quiet determination. The world had grown smaller, more fragile, and yet he remained a pillar of strength until the day he disappeared. On June 6, 1980, Ziggy was preoccupied with preparations for his goddaughter's upcoming wedding. That afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., Lottie asked him to pop out for a few essentials, groceries and household items they would need for the weekend. It was a short walk to the local shop, a familiar route that he had taken countless times. He left their home on Thornfield Crescent, exchanged a few words with a neighbor along the way, and made his way to the store. He arrived, made his purchases, paid, and stepped back into the streets, and then nothing. He never returned. No one saw where he went. No one heard a struggle. It was as if he stepped off the path of the ordinary life and into something else entirely. It was the morning of June 11th, 1980, when a man named Trevor Parker, a worker at the Tomlinson coal yard in Todmorden, arrived on shift, expecting the usual quiet hum of his routine. Instead, what he found stopped him cold. There, atop a pile of coal nearly 10 feet high, laid what he first mistook as a mannequin, motionless, pale, out of place in every way possible. The police arrived quickly. Among the first on the scene was Constable Alan Godfrey, a man who, until that day, had thought he had seen most things a beat cop might encounter. But nothing about this felt routine. His collie, PC Malcolm Daughtry, he climbed the mound carefully. The crunch of boots and coal was the only sound until the body came into view, still, surreal, and wrong. The body belonged to a man, later confirmed to be Ziggy Adamski, who vanished 5 days earlier without a trace. But there was no sign of struggle, no drag marks, no disturbance in the coal, and the strangest thing of all, his body was clean. There wasn't a speck of coal dust on his clothing or his hands. His trousers were slightly askew, but didn't suggest he climbed there himself, nor had been thrown. It was as though he had been placed there from above, delicately, without contacting the ground below. His upper body was bare, his shirt missing, but his jacket had been gently laid over his shoulders, almost with care. His hair, which he had always worn neatly combed, had been cropped haphazardly, uneven and short, as though someone had cut it in a rush. His facial hair had grown about a day's worth of stubble, although he had been missing for 5 days, suggesting that he had shaved at some point while he was gone. More disturbing still were the injuries. Burn-like marks, strange and precise, circled the back of his neck and shoulders, and smeared across those wounds was a thick, gel-like substance with a medicinal scent that no one could quite place. The police, as experienced as they were, couldn't identify it. Forensic specialists would later puzzle over its origin, but in that moment, on that coal mound, all anyone knew was that it didn't belong. His facial expression would linger in the memory of every officer who looked upon it. Eyes wide open, mouth slightly ajar, not in pain necessarily, but frozen in something deeper. Despair, dread, maybe even awe. It was the look of a man who had seen something he could not understand, something far beyond what his world had prepared him for. Other details included his missing wallet. So was his wedding ring, something his wife would later insist he never removed. Those absences, subtle as they were, weighed heavily alongside the larger mystery of how he ended up dead, clean and shoeless, on top of a cold pile under an open sky without anyone seeing a thing. The post-mortem examination of Ziggy Adamski's body was conducted by Dr. Alan Edwards, a consultant pathologist at the Royal Halifax Infirmary. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but that diagnosis raised more questions than it answered. There were still no signs of a violent struggle, no internal trauma, no defensive wounds. And yet, the expression on Zigmund's face, eyes wide, mouth agape, suggested something had terrified him in his final moments. Dr. Edwards would later remark that it looked as though he had died of fright. But what truly baffled investigators were the burn marks on his neck and shoulders. These weren't the results of a fire or scalding water. They were precise, circular, and oddly superficial, more like contact burns from a heated object. Even more perplexing was the gel-like substance smeared over the wounds. Forensic scientists tested it extensively but could not identify it. It wasn't any known medical ointment, industrial chemical, or household product. It simply didn't match anything in their database. Coroner James Turnbull, who presided over the inquest, would later call it the biggest mystery of my career. He noted that although Zigmund had been missing for 5 days, his beer showed only 1 day's worth of growth, and his stomach contained undigested food, suggesting that he had eaten not long before his death. So where had he been? Who had fed him? And why had no one seen him in the days between his disappearance and when his body was discovered? With no clear answers, speculation took root, and it grew wild. One of the more sensational theories to emerge in the wake of Zigmund Adamski's death was also one of the most enduring, though it sat firmly on the edge of public naivete. It wasn't whispered by scientists or detectives, but rather murmured in pubs, scribbled into letters to the editors, and brought up on late-night radio talk shows. The theory? That Zigmund Adamski had been abducted, not by earthly hands, but by belongings not of this world. To those who entertained the idea, the logic felt oddly tidy. The missing 5 days, the absence of coal dust on his clothes, despite having been found on a coal pile, the strange burn marks, precise, almost surgical, the application of thick, unidentifiable liquid, his missing shirt, his cropped hair, the untouched state of his body. Add that to his wide-eyed, terror-stricken expression frozen in death, and it didn't seem like the work of human hands. Some pointed out that the case involved similar symptoms: missing time, unexplained injuries, bizarre positions, had been loosely associated with UFO lore. The idea that Adamski had been taken, examined, and then hurriedly returned felt, to certain believers, like the only explanation that made sense precisely because it made none at all. If he had been abducted, perhaps something had gone wrong. Perhaps he had seen something he was never meant to see. Skeptics were quick to scoff the idea. No crafts were seen, no lights in the sky reported. There was no physical trace of any aerial events, no scorched ground, no disrupted vegetation, no radar anomalies. But proprietors of this theory would often raise a brow and say, "Of course there weren't." Some speculated that Zigmund had been the victim of a Cold War-era operation. In the shadow of the Cold War, paranoia wasn't just a political undercurrent. It was the way of life. And for some, the strange death of Zigmund Adamski seemed to echo that quiet menace of international espionage. Zigmund had been born in Poland in 1923, and like many of his countrymen, he fled the upheaval of post-war Europe and settled in England. He lived a quiet life in Yorkshire for decades, working as a coal miner, caring for his ailing wife, and keeping largely to himself. But to those who believed in the KGB theory, that past, his Polish roots, his proximity to Soviet borders at his youth, wasn't just background, it was motive. The theory goes like this. Zigmund Adamski may have once been involved in something, however minor, that caught the attention of Soviet intelligence. Perhaps he had knowledge of someone or something from his time in Poland. Perhaps he had refused to cooperate with a request long buried in his past. Or perhaps, more chillingly, he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The supporter of this theory pointed to the precision of the burns on his body, clean, circular, almost clinical. They suggested that these could have been the result of an interrogation technique or even experimental chemical agents. The unidentified gel found on his wounds? perhaps a Soviet compound, unknown to British forensics. The missing wallet and wedding ring, either removed to obscure his identity or taken as trophies. But this theory too has its cracks. There is no evidence that Zigmund Adamski had any political affiliations. No signs he was under surveillance. No ransom demands, no threats, no whispers of espionage in his personal life. He was a man in poor health, preparing for early retirement, more concerned with his wife's care than with international intrigue. And yet, the Cold War was a time when secrets were currency and silence was often enforced. The idea that Zigmund could have been swept up in something larger than himself, used, discarded, and left as a warning or a loose end, wasn't entirely out of step with the era's darker realities. Still, without documentation, without witnesses, and without a clear motive, the KGB theory remains just that, a theory. A more naturalistic explanation suggests that Zigmund had been struck by a ball of lightning, a rare, poorly understood atmospheric phenomenon. Ball lightning can cause burns and disorientation, and in theory could have stopped his heart. But this doesn't explain the missing items, his wallet and watch and wedding ring, or the cleanliness of his body and clothes. Nor does it account for the gel or the fact that he was found atop a coal pile with no coal dust on him. If he had been wandering in a daze, how did he end up there untouched by the environment? Among the more unsettling theories surrounding Zigmund Adamski's death is the idea that he may have been the unwitting subject of a classified experiment, a test subject in something far beyond public knowledge. This theory doesn't rely on extraterrestrials or Cold War spies, but rather the chilling possibility that someone, somewhere, was experimenting on human beings, and that Zigmund was one of them. The supporters to this theory point to the precise circular burns on his neck and shoulders, injuries that didn't match any known accident or natural cause. They weren't deep enough to be fatal, but they were deliberate, controlled, as if made by a device designed to test pain thresholds or neurological responses. The gel-like substance smeared over the wound only deepens the mystery. Forensic scientists couldn't identify it. It wasn't a known medical ointment, and it didn't match any industrial compound. It was as if it had come from a lab that hadn't officially existed. Then there's the matter of his missing time. Zigmund had been gone for only 5 days, and yet his beard showed only a day's worth of growth. His stomach contained recently eaten food. He hadn't been wandering the countryside. He had been somewhere, indoors, fed, possibly restrained. But where? Some theorists suggest that he may have been taken to a remote facility, perhaps even a mobile one, where he was subjected to tests involving chemical agents, electromagnetic fields, or psychological stressors. The goal? Unknown. The method? Untraceable. And yet, when it was over, whether by accident or design, he was returned, not to his home, but to the top of a coal pile, as if to say, "Look what we can do." Of course, there's no hard evidence, no whistleblowers, no documents, just a man who vanished and reappeared in a place he couldn't have reached on his own, bearing injuries no one could explain, traded with a substance no one could name. The market town of Todmorden, nestled in the rugged hills of Yorkshire, sits at the heart of what many call UFO Alley. Surrounding Pennine landscapes, wind-swept moors, steeped alleys, and ancient stone outcrops, it has long been a magnet for the unexplained. From the late 1970s to the 1980s, the area experienced a flap, a concentrated wave of UFO sightings that drew the attention of both local media and national investigators. Residents reported strange lights hovering silently over the hills, diamond-shaped crafts gliding across the sky, even missing time experiences. These weren't isolated incidences. They came in clusters, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes days. And they weren't just seen by stargazers or eccentrics. Police officers, farmers, school teachers, and entire families came forward with eerily similar accounts. The skies above Todmorden were alive with something no one could quite explain. Just a short drive east across the moors lies Ilkley Moor, another place steeped in folklore and now infamous for one of the most debated photographs in UFO history. In December of 1987, a retired police officer walking alone along the moor claimed to have encountered a small greenish humanoid figure. He managed to snap a single photograph before the creature vanished into the fog. Moments later, he reported seeing a saucer-shaped craft lift off and disappear into the sky. The photograph, grainy and eerie and endlessly scrutinized, became known as the Ilkley Moor alien. Under hypnosis, the man later recalled being paralyzed, taken aboard a craft, and shown apocalyptic visions before returning to the moor. The story was met with both fascination and skepticism, but it added another layer to the region's growing reputation as Britain's answer to Roswell. And it wasn't just Todmorden and Ilkley. Reports came from across Calder Valley, Holmfirth, Rubble Head, and beyond. In 2016, strange lights were seen hovering for hours over Rubble Head Viaduct, a Victorian-era railway bridge that cuts through the Pennines like a scar. Some described the lights as orbs. Others said it was a structured craft, but no one could explain it. Locals began to speak of the region as if it were alive with secrets. Some blamed the geology, the magnetic anomalies of the moorland. Others pointed to military activity or the proximity of Menwith Hill, a known intelligence base. But for many, the answer was simpler. Something was watching the skies over West Yorkshire, and sometimes it came closer than anyone expected. 5 months after the discovery of Adamski's body, it was the early hours of November 28, 1980, and Police Constable Alan Godfrey was nearing the end of a long shift in a quiet market town of Todmorden. The rain had come down hard earlier, leaving the roads slick and glistening under the amber glow of the street lamps. The town was still, the kind of stillness that only comes just before dawn. Godfrey had been dispatched to investigate a rather mundane report. A herd of cows had somehow escaped their field and were now wandering through residential gardens. It wasn't the kind of call that stirred excitement, but it was part of the job. He drove through the back lanes and fields, scanning hedge groves and driveways, but the cows were nowhere to be found. It was like they had vanished in the fog. Giving up the search, he turned his patrol car onto Burnley Road, intending to head back to the station and sign off. That's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a bus, something large and boxy blocking the road ahead. But as he drew closer, it became clear that this was no vehicle he recognized. Hovering silently about 5 feet above the ground was a diamond-shaped object, roughly 20 feet wide and 14 feet high. It spun slowly on its axis, and beneath it, the leaves on the road were swirling in the opposite direction, caught in some unseen force. Godfrey brought his car to a halt. His police radio and personal handset crackled with static, then completely silent. Instinctively, he reached for his notepad, the same one he used to sketch traffic accidents, and began to draw the object. It had a metallic sheen with what appeared to be windows or panels all around its midsection. The air felt charged, heavy with something he couldn't name. Then, a flash, a blinding white burst of light. The next thing he knew, he was driving again. Further down Burnley Road, the object was gone. Disoriented, he turned the car around and returned to the spot. What he found was even stranger. Despite the rain-soaked road, there was a perfectly dry, circular patch where the craft had hovered. The surface was bone dry and the tarmac showed a swirled pattern as if heat or energy had been applied in a spiral. And it was only dry on this spot for miles. Later, when the missing cows were finally located, they were found in a field that had also been rain-soaked, but there were no hoof prints, no sign of how they had gotten there. Godfrey didn't report the incident right away. He was a seasoned officer, not prone to flights of fancy, and he knew how this would sound. But when other witnesses came forward, a driver near Cliviger, and even officers from neighboring divisions who had seen strange lights descending into the valley, he realized that he wasn't alone. Still, something about that night gnawed at him. There were minutes he couldn't account for, a gap in time that refused to be filled. And though he tried to move on, the memory of that silent, spinning craft and the dry, swirled patch it left behind would follow him for the rest of his life. By the summer of 1981, the questions surrounding Godfrey Allen's encounter on Burnley Road only deepened. The missing time, 15 minutes that had simply vanished, was no longer just a curiosity, but it had become a weight. Godfrey didn't shake the feeling that something had happened in that gap, something just beyond reach. The split soles of his police boots, the strange dry patch of rain-soaked road, the confusing flashes of memory, they all pointed to a moment that had been erased. At the urging of UFO researchers and with the cooperation of a Manchester-based psychiatrist, Godfrey agreed to undergo hypnotic regression. The first session was conducted privately, without recordings. But as the sessions continued, 3 in total, spaced over several weeks, they were documented on video, creating a permanent record of what surfaced when his conscious mind had stepped aside. From the very first session, it was clear that what lay beneath was far stranger than anyone had anticipated. Under hypnosis, Godfrey described the moment the blinding beam of light struck his patrol car. The engine died, his radio cracked and went silent. Then, darkness. He lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was no longer in a vehicle. He was inside a room. But this wasn't the sterile, metallic interior so often described in abduction lore. The space was warm, almost rustic, like a cottage. The walls were wooden. The lighting was soft and golden. It was oddly familiar, but unmistakably wrong. And then, he wasn't alone. Standing before him was a tall, bearded man, dressed in a biblical-style robe and wearing a skull cap. His demeanor was calm, almost priestly. He didn't speak out loud, but communicated telepathically, his voice arriving fully formed in Godfrey's mind. He introduced himself as Yosef, sometimes spelled as Joseph in later transcriptions. Yosef told Godfrey that they already knew each other, though he didn't explain how. He also promised that they would meet again. Yosef wasn't alone either. Accompanying him were 8 small beings, each the size of about a 5-year-old child. They moved with mechanical precision and had lamp-shaped heads, smooth and featureless except for a faint glow. They didn't speak. They didn't seem curious. They simply began what Godfrey described as a non-invasive examination. He was placed on a table and wasn't restrained, and he wasn't frightened. The beings moved around him, scanning, observing, touching lightly. There were no needles, no pain, no collection of samples. Unlike the invasive procedures often described in reports American abduction stories have, this experience felt symbolic, almost ritualistic, dreamlike, as if the purpose wasn't a physical examination at all, but something else entirely. In the second session, more details emerged. Godfrey recalled a black dog, large and silent, sitting still in the corner of the room. It didn't move, it didn't blink, it simply watched. Its presence was never explained, but it added a surreal, almost folkloric layer to the scene, like something out of a myth, or a memory that didn't belong to him. The third session was the most fragmented. Godfrey described flashes, figures standing over him, a sensation of floating, a corridor that seemed to stretch and bend. But the images came in bursts, like a film reel missing frames. Some moments refused to surface, others flickered and vanished before they could be grasped. It was as if his mind had been carefully edited, just enough to leave him with questions, but not the full picture. Throughout the sessions, Godfrey always remained calm. He didn't panic, he didn't cry out. He simply described what he saw, what he felt. And when the session ended, he was left with more than a few memories. He was left with a sense of unfinished business. A door had been opened, and what lay beyond had remained hidden. In the months following his final hypnotic regression session, Alan Godfrey found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't asked for. What had begun as a private attempt to recover lost time had become public knowledge. The story of a uniformed police officer encountering a UFO and then recalling strange beings and a man named Yosef under hypnosis was too sensational to stay quiet. The press latched on, and the tabloids had a field day. And just like that, Alan Godfrey became the UFO cop. At first, it was jokes, harmless if a little crude. Colleagues at the station greeted him with mock salutes and nicknames. Captain Kirk was a favorite. But the laughter didn't last. Behind the teasing was something colder, suspicion and embarrassment, the sense that he had become a liability. Then came the visit. Godfrey would later recall being summoned into his inspector's office, where a man in civilian clothing was waiting. He was introduced as the man from the ministry, and he carried a file. Godfrey caught a glimpse of it. Inside were his sketches, reports, even notes from the Adamski case. The man cited the Official Secrets Act, and in no certain terms, Godfrey was warned to stop speaking to the press, to stop talking altogether. It was a chilling moment, and it changed everything. Though he was later medically evaluated and found psychologically sound, the damage was done. The whispers didn't stop. The jokes turned into avoidance. He was no longer just a beat cop. He was a problem, a headline, and a question mark. In 1984, after sustaining an unrelated injury, Godfrey was offered early retirement. He took it. Not because he wanted to leave, but because he knew he never would truly be welcomed back. The badge was no longer a fit. What followed was a slow unraveling. He drifted from job to job, butcher, security guard, odd work here and there. The structure of police life was gone, and with it a sense of purpose. He began drinking heavily, a bottle of whiskey a day by his own admission. His marriage collapsed in 1988. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced he was being watched, followed, monitored. Whether that fear was justified or not, it consumed him. And yet, through it all, he never recanted. Godfrey has always maintained that what happened on Burnley Road was real. The craft, the missing time, the dry patch on the road, he's less certain about the hypnosis memories. He said as much, but the encounter itself, that, he insists, was no dream. As for those tapes, the hypnotic sessions that once held raw, unfiltered memories of that night, they're now gone. Lost, misplaced, perhaps forgotten. But their absence only adds to the mythos. Like so much of the story, they hover just out of reach. Today, Godfrey speaks on the experience with a kind of wavery clarity. He doesn't ask to be believed, he doesn't need to be. He simply tells the story as it happened to him. And in doing so, he reminds us that sometimes the strangest part of a mystery isn't what's seen in the sky, but what happens after it touches the ground. Alan Godfrey never claimed to have all the answers. In fact, when it came to the hypnotic regression sessions, the ones that revealed Yosef, the black dog, the robotic beings, he was openly skeptical. He didn't deny what he'd said under hypnosis, but he wasn't convinced that those memories were literal truth either. He believed without hesitation that the UFO sightings on Burnley Road were real. The craft, the beam of light, the missing time, the dried swirl on the rainy road tarmac, those were physical, observable events. He'd seen them, he'd lived them. But the images that surfaced under hypnosis, that was another matter entirely. Godfrey has often said he wasn't sure if those memories were a dream, a screen memory, which is a kind of mental decoy, or simply a blend of subconscious imagery and reality. He acknowledged that the mind, especially under stress or trauma, can do strange things. It can protect, distort, and even invent. If he never ruled out the possibility that what he recalled in those sessions was his brain's attempt to make sense of something it couldn't fully process. Still, there is something about the consistency of his story, the emotional weight he carried afterward, that suggests that these weren't just idle fantasies. He didn't embellish, he didn't seek fame. In fact, he often seemed burdened by the whole experience, haunted not just by what he remembered, but by what he might never fully understand. And then there's the tapes. The sessions had been recorded, at least the later ones, but over time, those recordings disappeared. Misplaced, lost, or perhaps, someone stole them. Godfrey would later speak about them with a kind of quiet resignation. The evidence was gone, the memories, though, remained, and the truth, whatever it was still out of reach. As the dust settled around Alan Godfrey's hypnotic revelations and the media frenzy began to fade, one detail from the original Adamski case continues to gnaw at investigators and armchair sleuths alike: the ointment. It had been found smeared across the burns on the back of Zigmund Adamski's neck and shoulders, a thick yellow-green substance with a faint medicinal scent. Forensic scientists at the time had tested it extensively. It wasn't a known pharmaceutical. It wasn't industrial. It was something they couldn't identify. The State Forensic Laboratory in Wetherby, where the sample was sent to, eventually closed its doors in 2012, and with it, any hope of retesting the material using modern technology. It seemed to have vanished. But the mystery of the ointment didn't just linger. It began to grow teeth. Some speculate that this substance was not of this world. Others suggest it was a part of a classified chemical compound used in secret experiments or covert operations. And that's when the whispers began about the men in black. Not the Hollywood caricatures, but real ones. The ones described in hushed tones by UFO witnesses across the globe. Men in dark suits, arriving unannounced, flashing credentials no one could verify, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. They didn't threaten, not directly, but their presence was enough to make people forget what they'd seen, or at least stop talking about it. And in Todd Morden, those whispers weren't just rumors. Following the discovery of Adamski's body, 2 unidentified men reportedly visited the local police station. They weren't in uniform, they didn't give names, but they asked to speak with the officers who had been at the scene. According to later accounts, they reviewed the case files, asked pointed questions about the ointment, and then left, without explanation. No one knew who they were, and no one saw them again. Alan Godfrey himself would later recall being visited by a man in civilian clothing, the man from the ministry, who cited the Official Secrets Act and warned him to stay quiet. Whether this man was connected to the ointment, the Adamski case, or something else entirely remains unclear. But the timing was hard to ignore. And so this ointment, this strange, unidentifiable bomb, became more than just forensic anomaly. It became a symbol, a thread, a clue that something larger, more organized and far more secretive may have been at play. Because in a case already filled with missing time, unidentified substances, and unexplained death, the idea that someone was watching from the shadows didn't feel like paranoia. It felt like the next chapter. For all the talk of UFOs, secret experiments, and shadowy figures in dark suits, there was always a quieter theory, one that didn't require the extraordinary, but still left behind a trail of unsettling questions. It came not from the tabloids or the fringe, but from within Zigmund Adamski's own family. In the weeks after his death, whispers began to surface that Zigmund had been under pressure to return to Poland. His wife Lottie was gravely ill with multiple sclerosis and confined to a wheelchair. The strain of caregiving had taken its toll on Zigmund, both physically and emotionally. He had recently applied for early retirement from the coal mine, and though initially denied, the approval letter arrived the day after he vanished, a cruel twist of timing. There was also a family wedding approaching, his goddaughter's in fact, and Zigmund was meant to walk her down the aisle. He had written a speech. He was looking forward to it, or so it seemed. But according to some accounts, not everyone in the family believed he was in good spirits. There were rumors of a feud, a falling out with relatives whose wife had taken out a restraining order and moved in with Lottie. Some speculated that Zigmund had become entangled in a domestic dispute, one that may have escalated behind closed doors. One theory suggests that he was kidnapped, not by strangers but by someone he knew, that maybe he had been held somewhere, perhaps in a shed or an outbuilding, against his will, and that the stress combined with his existing heart condition led to his death. The burn on his neck, possibly the result of restraints or even chemical exposure, and the ointment, a crude attempt to treat the wound. The missing wallet and wedding ring, removed to delay identification or perhaps taken in haste. It's a theory that paints a tragic picture, not of aliens or agents, but of a man caught in a web of family tension, illness, and emotional strain. A man who may have been trying to hold everything together, only to unravel in the most mysterious of ways. And yet, even this theory struggles to explain the full picture. If he was held somewhere, why was there no trace of him in any hospital or shelter? Why was his body so clean? His clothes free of coal dust, his wounds treated with a substance no one could identify. And how did he end up on top of the coal pile, in a town where he had no known connections? Like every theory in the Adamski case, this one answers some questions while raising others. It grounds the mystery in human drama, but it still leaves us staring at the same unsolvable puzzle. And maybe that's the most haunting part of it all, that even the most plausible explanations still leave us in the dark. So much of the Zigmund Adamski case leaves us suspended between the rational and the unbelievable, between conspiracy and coincidence, between this world and perhaps something else. Was his death the result of a domestic conflict gone tragically wrong? A kidnapping masked in a strangeness? Or did he cross paths with a force no one could name? Not then, not now. And what if Alan Godfrey, the police officer pulled into the heart of the unknown, a man who asked for none of this and yet became the most reluctant witness? His story, like Adamski's, remains unsolved, but not for lack of facts, but because the facts refuse to fit. Perhaps because the truth, if there is one, was never meant to be easy. Cases like this linger not because they're unsolved, but because they're unyielding. They remind us that even the calmest night in the quietest towns, the veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary can grow thin, and sometimes someone steps through. This is Amanda Joy, Until next time, stay curious, trust the strange, and let the flashlights guide your way.